My name is Rudy Garns. I'm an associate professor in the philosophy program. I also teach some honors courses, and I work with integrative studies for a year. I've been at NKU for about 23 years now. Well, as a philosopher, we have some debates about what knowledge is and how even philosophers should go about gathering knowledge and making claims about knowledge. It's interesting. I think many people think of philosophy as not having changed much over the past 2,500 years. We're still debating the same issues. The same themes are coming up. I'm still teaching and reading Plato. So many students, I think, have the feeling as though we haven't really advanced at all. It's still rehashing of the same issues. I think that's probably wrong. I think it's probably fair to say that there's a lot of work being done trying to figure out what Plato was saying, but there's an awful lot of work being done debating whether Plato was right or not. And these more current debates aren't just rehashing the old issues. They're debates that are informed by new things that have come up, things we've learned in science, things that we've learned in the humanities and the arts and so forth. So I think we can see that philosophy has made advances. There are a number of ways in which philosophers think about how they're justifying their claims or making claims to new knowledge. The classic view, which probably does come out of Socrates and Plato, is the armchair philosopher. So we sit in our comfortable chairs, we sit by the fire with brandy, as Hume talks about, and we think about these big issues. I guess the way that's supposed to go is that philosophers will have these intuitions. We'll all have these intuitions about these big issues like justice, morality, what kinds of things there are in the world, free will, and so forth. And then we try to take these intuitions and theorize about them, try to find a comprehensive theory that explains the intuitions that we have. Then we get together at conferences and we share these theories and we debate them, and we sort of approach it by being critical about each other's arguments. We have you kind of valid argument here and so forth. And we try to reach some kind of consensus on what those foundational assumptions or premises ought to be. Now, it's very much a rational sort of enterprise. It's very much a foundational kind of enterprise. And the assumption is you start with something sort of theory neutral, and you build your way up into theories that will generalize and explain all those intuitions. Another model that sort of comes out in the 20th century, something we might call a linguistic turn, I suppose, is philosophers saw themselves as clarifying. So many thought ordinary language sort of contained sort of the truths that we were getting at, and so we were taking these complicated concepts like free will or justice, and we were breaking them down and trying to figure out, well, what does this concept really entail? And then in the process of clarifying, you either dissolve the issue, it just goes away, and it's not really an issue after all, you've sort of gotten rid of all the problems, or you fine-tuned it in a way that now you can pass it off to other disciplines. So it might end up being a physics problem or a biology problem or a psychology problem. And so many philosophers thought that's what we should be doing in the middle of the 20th century. There's a third model that I would recommend that I think it's not necessarily new, although I think it got some new credibility with John Rawls in the 70s when he talks about a thing called reflective equilibrium. And I like to think of this as almost parallel to what the scientific method is. So if you think about the way the scientific method works, forget about your first chapter in your science textbook. That's a very sort of a simple model. But when you think about what scientists really do, their observations aren't theory neutral. Their observations are coming out of their learning and what they think they know and their beliefs and their values. And they see things in the world and they catalog them, and then they try to form hypotheses and theories about these things. Sometimes you create a hypothesis and you run the experiment to check it, and it doesn't work. In practice, what happens is you don't reject the hypothesis. What really happens is you go back and make sure you had everything plugged in. You go back and make sure that you read the meter properly. You go back and make sure you were controlling for all the right variables. There are lots of things that could have gone wrong that got you the result you weren't expecting. So you don't just sort of simply run the experiment. If it doesn't work, you get rid of your theory. If it does work, you've endorsed you've confirmed your theory. And then if you think about the bigger picture, what scientists do is they're trying to find a kind of a match between the observations they make all the time and the theories they're coming up with. So it may be that sometimes you throw out your observations. I mean, sometimes you think, I just didn't see that right, or the microscope wasn't properly set up, or the telescope wasn't properly set up. So sometimes you reject the observations, and sometimes you reject the theories, or you modify the theories. It's hard to reject a theory that's been around for a long time and does an awful lot of explanatory work and is well endorsed by all your experiments, but it's possible, it happens. It's easier to get rid of observations sometimes and sort of redo the experiment. What you're doing is you're trying to find a kind of equilibrium between when do you revise your theories and when do you question your observations. Now, I think philosophers work the same way. I think we have intuitions about various kinds of issues, hard issues, moral issues, and so forth. And then we theorize about what's motivating them. And then we check them against each other with thought experiments and discussions and critical evaluations. And sometimes we find that it's best to revise our intuitions change. You know, I thought that was the right answer, but now that I hear this, I think maybe I'll back off and say this instead. All right? Sometimes you stick to your guns and you say, my intuition's right on this, I think your theory is wrong. And so over a long process of sort of reflective kinds of practices, we find we aim towards a kind of equilibrium between what our intuitions are and what our theories are. So a real good example of this that comes up in ethical theory today is the famous trolley example, where you imagine yourself standing by the tracks and you're seeing a runaway trolley careening down the hill. The conductor has passed out or something, there's no stopping it, and it's heading towards 5 people who are trapped on the tracks and they can't escape. And you find yourself right beside a lever that if you pulled the lever, you could divert the trolley to another track, saving the 5 people. But unfortunately, there's this single individual on that track who will be killed if you pull that lever. Now, what do? Do you do nothing and let the 5 people die, or do you pull that lever, sacrificing the 1 to save the 5? Most people, 70–80%, would pull the lever. Not everybody, but most people would. And when you ask them why, what's your rationale, they'll give you the numbers. They'll say, well, it's better to save 5 at the expense of 1. They don't like killing 1, but as I set up the thought experiment, you have these just stark choices. Now, you change it a little bit to see, is that really the theory? Is that really the principle they're using when they're doing this? So you change the example, and now you imagine yourself, same runaway trolley, except now you're on a little footbridge standing over the track, and you're seeing all this unfold. There's no lever to pull, but there's a very, very big man leaning over the bridge. And he's just teetering over watching this happen too, and he's big enough that if you could push him over the bridge onto the tracks, that would slow the trolley down and save the 5 people. So do you push this guy over the bridge onto the track to save the 5 people? Now, most people will say no, right? Including the people who said yes before. Now, this is sort of interesting because now you realize that they're not using the kind of utilitarian principle of adding up how many lives you save or how much happiness there is in the world. There's something else motivating their intuitions here. Probably something to do with it being an up close and personal. I've got to push them. I got to touch them. I got to directly move them in the line of their death. Now you have a chance to explore a little bit better. Sort of, well, do you want to change your intuitions about these cases? Do you want to change your views about what principles should be motivating you? And I think that's more like what happens. Now, if you're in a class full of people or in a conference full of people, and they're all sharing these kinds of ideas, now you get a real movement towards a kind of equilibrium. You have more things to evaluate, more intuitions to evaluate, and you'll see some people changing intuitions and some people changing theories. And I think as this continues, this is how progress is made. Our theories get better because we're always challenging our intuitions, and our intuitions get better because we're always trying to modify our theories. And so you're moving towards a kind of equilibrium. So I like that as a model of how philosophers gain knowledge and how we make progress. We're aiming at a kind of coherence between what our intuitions are and what our theories are. Now you asked about some innovations that philosophy might have experienced over the years. There are a number of ways of reading that. I mean, it's not like we've invented a new kind of machine or test tube to do our work. Sometimes there are some new kinds of thought experiments that sort of come along that really sort of revolutionize the kinds of thinkings that we do. The trolley experiment and variations of that are one example. I think in the history of philosophy, you will see that there are some real turns that have been made. And I'll go back to Socrates. I think what we might call the Socratic turn was really, I think, very important for philosophy. And this is where Socrates takes Greek philosophy from being a kind of natural science, where philosophers worried about the way the world works. They worried about causation and what's going on when a leaf turns from green to gold in the fall. How could one thing survive and yet change at the same time? And so, that's a metaphysical kind of question. And Socrates introduces a whole new line of questioning about justice and morality and social concerns and individual concerns. And I think that turn just revolutionized the way philosophy gets done and the kinds of questions that get asked. We have a very important Kantian revolution that happens, kind of modeled on the Copernican revolution, where with Copernicus, we sort of have this sort of Gestalt shift where we were in the center of the universe and now we're not in the center of the universe. And Kant does a similar kind of thing by forcing us to recognize that maybe we're contributing ideas to the world, not just reading the world as it really is. Maybe the conceptual framework that we're using is sort of placed on the world, not something sort of gathered from the world. That was very important in how we think about things. I mentioned the linguistic turn in the 20th century, I think is very important. So there have been these moments where I think philosophy has provided a new kind of perspective on problems that I think has been very, 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 very valuable. I think most recently, something that sort of I appreciate, I'm doing a course in neuroethics right now, so I've been reading a lot about the trolley problem and whether we push people off bridges or pull levers, but something that there's sort of been a kind of a partnership between neuroscience, cognitive science, other sciences, and philosophy that I think help inform the way we think about these things. So there's a philosopher who's also working in a neuroscience lab at Harvard, a young fellow named Joshua Green, who was actually looking at the brains of people as they make these decisions. So what's going on when they decide to push a guy off the bridge, or they decide to pull a lever or something? And he found there are actually differences in what's going on in their brains. That certain kinds of emotional parts of our brain are more active when we're thinking about pushing somebody than if we're just pushing a lever and the guy is in the distance somewhere. How much should that inform us in thinking about morality? Well, I don't think it tells us what we ought to do. I don't think I would directly go there, but I think if we could find that, I think we would find that we would like to have a theory that sort of brings into some kind of agreement what we're actually doing, what's happening in our brains and what we're learning about in science with what we think we ought to be doing. And so the more we understand, say in this case, how our brains work when we're making moral judgments, I think the more likely it is we'll have things to think about as we consider our theories for moral theories. For example, I think in some ways what Green is coming up with is showing that these emotional centers are very important in moral judgments. We know that, for example, psychopaths oftentimes have damage to their frontal cortex, their prefrontal cortex, which is very much responsible, very much implicated in adding a kind of emotional flavor to our judgments. And so they have a hard time caring about moral decisions. They understand them. I mean, they can do the rational bit, but they have a hard time caring and feeling about moral. And that's kind of an important insight into how we make our moral judgments. So I think I mentioned reflective equilibrium earlier. I think the other piece is what might sometimes call wide reflective equilibrium, where we're not just in art discipline trying to sort of get our theories to line up with our intuitions. We're trying to get the theories and intuitions in our discipline to line up with the rest of the world. And so what philosophers are coming up with ought to line up with what biologists are coming up with what neuroscience are coming up with. Another, I think, very important example is Plato introduces the idea of our having innate knowledge. He thinks the best way to explain how I could know necessary truths like we find in mathematics and geometry, these aren't things I just pick up by, he would argue, by generalizing, by having seen lots of squares or adding up lots of even numbers. He thinks that we sort of recognize these things when we first see them, or very early when we see them. And so he believes we bring this knowledge to the experiences that we have. We must be born with this knowledge. Now, he didn't have a lot of science to work with on this. He thought we were reincarnated and we were born with these ideas. This later gets challenged. John Locke is famous for his blank slate and the idea of the mind is born blank. And we don't have any of these ideas or principles or knowledge written on that blank slate. Now, Locke had a kind of a crude psychology of the mind going on here. It wasn't scientific, but it was philosophical. But his way of thinking about the mind informs the way he thinks about innate ideas, and so he's willing to reject that idea based on that. Move forward to the 20th century, and the issue comes alive again. It comes alive partly because of Darwin and the introduction of the new Darwinism. We have genetics, and we can talk about how maybe some of these things might be coded in our genes and then sort of developed in our brains as we develop. And then you get to someone like Noam Chomsky, who in the 1960s is reacting to the behaviorism of B.F. Skinner and people like that who thought everything was learned blank slate all the way. And Chomsky is saying, no, that if you look at how young children learn language, they learn it very, very early with very little experience, not a lot of data to sort of generalize on, and then they seem to go well beyond the data they have. I mean, the stimuli they're working with is sort of impoverished when you think about it. They're able to recognize grammatical phrases without a lot of exposure to grammatical phrases. And so Chomsky proposes that we might have innate knowledge of a kind of universal grammar, you might call it. Very crude, not the language we learn in English or Swahili or Japanese, Chinese, but enough to get a child going, and that's a kind of an innate knowledge. So Chomsky's idea was that we have this innate universal grammar that we're using. Recent work, I think, in neuroscience and recent work in genetics is sort of now suggesting that maybe there are alternatives to that. So I think we can see that the advances in science can be borrowed by philosophers to even raise questions about that. So, for example, many neuroscientists now would adopt a more of a constructivist kind of approach. We aren't born with these brain modules intact, but in fact we're born with a kind of developmental matrix that when you're out there exposed to the world, and we're all exposed to roughly the same world and the same kinds of experiences, that we quite naturally all move in this direction. So it looks as though we're all agreeing about these things. But they suggest, and there's some modeling done with neural networks, artificial neural networks, suggesting is that these networks, particularly one as powerful as the brain, really could learn these kinds of things without having them innately sort of built in. I think there are questions coming from genetics as well as to whether or not you're not going to be able to find or identify a particular gene that's going to lead to something like a particular piece of knowledge or a particular way of framing knowledge. I think that's just too far away. So I think there's a huge challenge to what Chomsky was doing now, coming out of science. So I guess the way to think about philosophy today, and not everybody agrees with this, it's still a controversial issue, I suppose, but I think the real excitement in philosophy today is the way philosophers are willing to borrow from the advances we have in other sciences: genetics, neuroscience, cognitive science, anthropology, sociology, the social sciences. I just think there's an awful lot to be learned there that are going to, and again, back to reflective equilibrium. If the idea is to get this wide equilibrium going, you want to make sure that the kinds of things you're thinking about in philosophy, the theories you're proposing in philosophy, aren't so far out of step that they can't help make sense of what's making sense in physics and biology and psychology and sociology. So as I see philosophy, I see it as being part of that bigger picture. It's not an isolated discipline. It's a discipline very much embedded in the way of building knowledge about the world as a whole.